So we're here at Salisbury House in Des Moines, Iowa. Salisbury House is in the South of Grand neighborhood here in town, and it's a home that was built by Carl and Edith Weeks in the 1920s. They actually broke ground in 1923, and their aim was really to emulate the great English manor homes here in Iowa, here in Des Moines. Carl himself did not come from money. Everything in Salisbury House is sort of the result of this great sort of self-made man story. He's born in 1876 in Lynn County, Iowa, and his family has some difficult financial times, certainly. They end up moving out to Kansas when Carl is just a young boy. They try to make a go of it on a homestead out in Kansas. Ultimately, that doesn't work out for them, and they end up moving back to Des Moines around the 1890s. At that point, Carl enters the pharmaceutical trade, which is what his mother's brother, so his maternal uncles, this was the field in which they worked. So Carl goes to pharmacy school, becomes a pharmacist, and it's through his work in the pharmacy field that he develops what literally becomes his million-dollar idea, which is women's cosmetics. What Carl develops is essentially women's foundation. So he combines powder with cold cream and perfume and creates foundation essentially and markets this under the Armand Cosmetics Company. The company's incorporated around 1915, 1916, and between then and the early 1920s, Carl literally becomes a millionaire. Armand powder is one of the top-selling powders in the 1920s in the United States. So by the early 1920s, Carl and Edith, and their 4 boys by that point, have amassed enough wealth to think about building something like Salisbury House. On a visit to England, 1920, 1921, they go to Salisbury, England, and they see a house called the King's House, a home that was built over centuries, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, in England. And it's this house that really is the inspiration for Salisbury House here in Des Moines. So after seeing that home in England, Carl and Edith come back to Des Moines inspired. And it's in 1923 that they break ground here at Salisbury House. The house is finished enough by 1926 for the family to move in. It's completely finished in 1928. Carl Weeks was a man of many and varied interests. One of the most notable legacies of his interests are his amazing collections that both he and Edith amassed in terms of artworks, sculpture, the library collection, and particularly the library, as we'll see later, is an amazing collection of rare, limited first edition works, medieval manuscripts. It's incredible. So Carl Weeks collected the books that he collected not only because they're important historical works, but also because he believed that books themselves were works of art and had a worth beyond the words on the page. So he collected almost every edition of Leaves of Grass. Now, Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman changed over time. Whitman added poems, but for Carl, it was the art of collecting, the art of amassing a collection of such worth that it reflected these different sort of elements of the craft. So this book here is our first edition, Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman from 1855. The cover has already been detached, so I'll go ahead and remove it. And you can see on the inside sort of reviews of Whitman's work that he himself had pasted on the inside of this first edition. This was a book that he printed himself, and he sent copies of it to renowned writers of his day, most famously to Ralph Waldo Emerson. Ralph Waldo Emerson writes back to Whitman and says something to the effect of, "I greet you at the beginning of a great career." And in successive editions, Whitman includes this sort of blurb from Emerson, without Emerson's permission, mind you, on the spine of his successive editions that are printed. One of the most famous interiors in literary history is here. Whitman doesn't sign his name. He includes this image of himself opposite the title page. Whitman in Leaves of Grass is aiming for an American voice in literature. So he's sort of portraying himself as this new voice, as this American coming out with this work of poetry to really make this first step towards establishing an American literary voice. So printed in Brooklyn, New York in 1855. And this piece, particularly transitioning from our discussion of the religious texts, also suggests the diversity of Carl Weeks' collecting. He focused on, in some instances, on religious texts, but he also included an incredible amount of literary works as well. So we've got upwards of 20 editions of Leaves of Grass in our collection. Carl also collected, shifting into the 20th century, a variety of first editions of Ernest Hemingway's work. So this is The Green Hills of Africa by Hemingway, published in 1935. And this is a great piece because it illustrates the personal relationship that existed between Carl Weeks and Ernest Hemingway. So this inscription, to Carl Weeks, instead of a drink at Peña's, with very best wishes, Ernest Hemingway. So Peña's, we've discovered, was a bar in Key West, that one of the bars that Hemingway very famously frequented. We also have in our collections a postcard from Ernest Hemingway to Carl Weeks. Carl had planned a trip to Florida. Hemingway is writing to him saying he's not going to be in Florida at the time that he's fishing, but there's been great sail fishing off of a particular part of Florida. So within our collections, we have these two great sort of Hemingwayan pursuits, drinking and fishing. We also have a photo of Edith Weeks, Carl's wife, at Sloppy Joe's Bar in Havana, Cuba, which was another Hemingway haunt. So the work itself, this first edition of The Green Hills of Africa, is great, but then we also have that personal connection between Carl Weeks and Ernest Hemingway that is really fantastic. Another wonderful component of our collection is our James Joyce collection. We have first editions of Ulysses, Finnegan's Wake. This particular work that we're seeing now are the galley proofs for Tales Told of Shem and Shawn. So Tales Told of Shem and Shawn was part of Works in Progress by James Joyce, which eventually is published as Finnegan's Wake. Tales Told of Shem and Shawn was published in 1929 by the Black Sun Press, and these are galley proofs from that printing that are hand-marked and in some cases signed or initialed by James Joyce himself. This is an incredible piece. All of the objects that we've seen speak to this longer history of bookmaking, from the earliest handwritten manuscripts completed in medieval scriptoria to the Gutenberg Bible leaf, which of course marks this fundamental shift in European history in general, and in bookmaking in particular, to books being printed in the vernacular, in the language that every person on the street could read. From there, we transition, of course, to the early modern into the modern era, where we see greats like Whitman, like Ernest Hemingway, like Joyce, taking advantage of the written word, manipulating it, using it in these really innovative ways. And all of these pieces tell that broader story of bookmaking, of communicating on the page. I guess in terms of visitors to Salisbury House, we get a range of folks who come by. We have people who come by, adults who come by for visits. We have school tours. We have a variety of public programming scattered throughout the year. We have a history series, which we bring well-known authors for. We have a Holly and Ivy event over the holidays. So Salisbury House is really sort of a public forum, in addition to being a historic house museum, for these different events and different constituencies that we bring to the property. The running of the house, the funding for Salisbury House is through our private nonprofit corporation, Salisbury House Foundation. After the foundation took over, late 90s, early 2000s, there was extensive renovation done to the house. A new roof was put on, all new wiring was run through the house, HVAC systems were updated. The library itself is now, the whole house is secured on a security system. The library itself has its own unique fire suppression system and security system as well. So we really strive to maintain that balance between keeping the house open to the public, adhering to our mission of preserving, interpreting, and sharing Salisbury House, and also, again, finding that balance between sharing and interpreting and preservation and conservation of our incredible collections that we have.